Would you pray with me, please? Gracious Heavenly Father, we really do pray for you to come. But until you do, we ask for wisdom. It just so seems so apparent to me that we are bombarded every day with challenges and just so many different things that vie for our attention. And some of them, even the little things, do deserve to be addressed. Some of them are extremely important, but so many of them are just a waste of our time and distracting from what we're really here to do. So God, give us the insight and the wisdom to know what to focus on and what to lay aside so that we can make the most of the time that you give us and really make a difference with our lives. God, that's what we're praying for, I ask in Jesus' name. If you got your Bibles and you want to follow along, we're in Revelation chapter 2. Revelation chapter 2, I'm going to start reading in verse 18. This is the church at Thyatira. It says in verse 18, Revelation chapter 2, to the angel of the church in Thyatira write, these are the words of the Son of God, whose eyes are like blazing fire and whose feet are like burnished bronze. His eyes are like flaming fire. His feet are like burnished bronze. I'm always interested when reading through the letters to the seven churches. There are some things that Jesus says to every one of the churches, such as he who has ears to hear, let him hear. Right? It's kind of like there's something here. Don't just turn your mind off. There's something that everybody can glean. There's something we can learn from this, and he wants us to learn, right? So he says that to all the churches. But there's also unique things that he says to each one of the churches, and one of the unique qualities is the way that he introduces himself. Well, Jesus introduces himself or pictures himself to the church at Thyatira as one who has eyes of flaming fire and his feet are like burnished bronze. What in the world is Jesus trying to convey? We even use expressions like this today. His gaze burned a hole in me, right? We say things like that. They looked right through me, right? It was like a burning look. That's what he's kind of communicating here. In other words, there's this presentation we make to other people, the way we want other people to see us. Jesus sees right through all that. And he sees who we really are. There's a story, it's made the rounds for the longest time. And I'm sure it's been embellished and told in different ways. But I'm also believing that there's a grain of truth in this story. It's a story about a Hollywood producer, one of these big Hollywood parties. He's a filthy rich guy, right? And there's all sorts of people there, and people want to make acquaintances with him in particular because he's got so much influence, he's got so much money. And there's this young lady, she's an aspiring actress. You know, she wants to break into Hollywood, so to speak. And so she's at that party, and she wants to rub shoulders with people like him. Well, he comes up to her, and he propositions her. He sees her, and he pretty much comes right out and says, if I gave you $1 million, would you have an affair with me? Would you sleep with me? And she kind of cracked a smile, thinking to herself, a heavy price to pay, but you know what? It's for my career. And so she says, I think something can be arranged. That's the way she responded. And so he quickly said, well, how about $100? How about if I just give you $100? Would you sleep with me? And she said, you know, she's very offended, and she says, what kind of woman do you think I am? And his response was, we've already established what kind of woman you are. Now we're just haggling on the price. I know that's kind of a crude story, but I've always appreciated that story for what it communicates. Sometimes it's the $1 million that fogs our vision as to what kind of people we really are. Do you understand what I'm saying? Sometimes the situation, the people involved, it's my job, there's so much money and everything else, it fogs our vision for what kind of standards and what kind of people we really are. And I think one of the things that Jesus is communicating to all of us, and especially the church at Thyatira, is I don't care what the business says. I don't care what everybody else says. I see right through it. I know what kind of person you really are. Well, here's a problem. When we look deep within, most of us don't like what's there. So the question is there anything we can do about it? And the answer is yes. In fact, Jesus is not just, accusing them and leaving them, your judge, that's it. No, he's saying this so that they will change. He's saying this to us so that we can change. What you're going to find when you go through just about all these 7 letters is you're going to find a basic outline. It's not true with all 7 letters because some of the churches are in a worse condition than others. But basically, here's what Jesus does. Jesus introduces himself in a unique way. Then he says something positive. You're doing something great. Let me pat you on the back, so to speak. Then he says something negative as far as this is what you need to work on. And then he has kind of a challenge that he leaves with each one of the churches. Now, it's a little bit different, but that's the basic outline that you're going to find with the church of Thyatira. He presents himself as the one who has the eyes of blazing fire, the feet. By the way, the feet of burnished bronze. That's kind of like saying his feet were set in stone, right? It's kind of like saying, I've got my standards, and my standards have not changed. If there's been a change here, it's you. It's not me, right? That's the way Jesus presents himself. But then what he does next is he'll say, here's something you're doing really good. And then he's going to say, here's something that's not so good that you need to work on. And then he's going to leave them with a challenge. Here's what I want us to do this morning. As we look through these verses, I want us to say to ourselves, listen, to become the kind of person that Jesus will be pleased with when he sees me, the kind of person that I want to be, right, for Jesus, right? Here's what I need to work on. I need to do a little bit more. Here's what I need to avoid. Right? Here's the things I need to get out of my life. And then here's something I need to always keep in the back of my mind. Those are the steps that I want us to take. So let's go through this. Right after he introduces himself, the very next thing he goes to is the good stuff. Here's what you're doing. That's good, and you ought to keep doing it, right? It's in the very next verse, verse 19. After introducing himself, here's what Jesus says. Verse 19, I know your deeds, your love and faith, your service and perseverance. You trust me. You believe in me, you have love, you're hanging in there, all that's great. But here's the real defining part of the verse, at least it seems to me. He says, I know your deeds, your love, your faith, your service and perseverance, and that you are now doing more than you did at first. So it's not just, hey, you're doing things that I like. He's saying it's really good that you're growing and that you're doing more now than you did before. I had a dear friend when I was over in Orlando. His name's Marvin Lawton. Marvin was one of the leaders in the church over there that I got to work with for several years. And Marvin, every year on his birthday, would take the day off from work. And I'm sure, he had a big family, and they probably had the cake, and you know what people do, celebrate birthdays. But what he would do on his birthday is he would also make sure and take some time to himself. So he'd take the day off from work, and he'd take some time just to himself on his birthday every year. And here's what he did. He was one of these kind of guys who journaled. He every week would write down key things that happened in his life and what he was doing and his plans. He'd just kind of keep track of those things. On his birthday, he'd pull out all the journals. And he would look at his life, and he would, as honestly as he could, evaluate how he had lived as a follower of Christ that year. And here's the number one question he would keep in his mind. Did I do more this year than I did the year before? He'd look at his checkbook. Did I give more? Did I support more missions? Did I get involved more? Did I do more service at the church? Have I learned more from my study and my devotions? He would just ask himself this basic question, am I growing? I think that's a question every Christian needs to ask, and I'll just be real honest with you. I don't care how old you are. I'm old too. We don't get off the hook. We're not done till God calls us home. And there's always something we can do, and the thing I really think we ought to be focused on is not, well, I'm doing stuff at the church. That's not what we're talking about. Am I doing more? Have I raised the bar? Have I tried? When I say this, listen, I want to be as honest as I possibly can. Book of James says not everybody's going to be a teacher. Not everybody should be a teacher, right? 1 Corinthians chapter 12, we're like different parts of the body. Everybody's going to do their part, right? So you're going to be unique in what you do, and other people are going to be unique in what they do. All that taken into consideration, still ask yourself the question, am I doing more? Have I helped more? Do you understand this? I was having a conversation with a guy I went to Bible college with years ago, and he's preaching up in Illinois now. This is a couple of weeks ago. We were on the phone. We were talking about some different things. And I don't mean to leave you with the wrong impression, because in the interest of time, I'm only going to talk about something negative, but most of the conversation was really good. I mean, the church is going great. There's a lot of things to be very thankful for, very positive. But there's a concern that he has, that I have as well. And it's about our Bible colleges. And I do not mean this to sound like throwing our Bible colleges under the bus. I'm very, very grateful for a lot that our Bible colleges have done through the years. There's just one aspect of this. And in the interest of time, I know I'm not doing this justice, so forgive me for saying this way. But we were talking, and there's a school that we both know of, and it's up north, and it's a big Bible college in the Restoration Movement, our churches, right? And this has been a few years ago now, but hundreds of students there, right? And so on the outside, everything looks really good. And you know what? There are a lot of good things happening at that school. There have been through the years. A lot of people are going there 4 years. They're being trained in Bible and in ministry. And I'm sure they're better equipped to live for God as a result of that, right? But he and I both noticed that of all these hundreds of people, there was only like 3 that were trained to work as preachers for congregations in churches. Hundreds of people going through Bible colleges, and this is just the old guy in me. It used to be that's what the Bible college was for. Because we're training people for ministry working in the local church. And I'm glad in a lot of ways that it's expanded to train people for a whole lot of other things. But the problem was, and this is where, I don't mean to sound too critical here, but this is where it changed our conversation. Because even though I went to school with him, he's older than me. He was upperclassman at the time. He's an older guy than I am. Wow. Okay. And he's really concerned because his church is growing. He's got a big church up in Illinois. And there's nobody he can hand the church over to as far as leading the ministry there. And he's really concerned. They've been looking for the longest time. And he says, Mark, I don't know what to do. And I said, Bill, maybe you need to train somebody yourself. Maybe you need to train somebody yourself. Why am I telling you about this conversation? Because it made me think. You guys know a guy by the name of Gabe Ramirez? Gabe Ramirez, you know who Gabe Ramirez is? He's a missionary. He's a missionary to international students. He works at a university up in Indiana, right? He's got a great ministry going on. Some of you get his newsletter and everything else. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. You know where he went to Bible college? Right here. Do you know a guy named Parker Muckenthaler? Does that name? That's not a name you can easily forget, right? Parker Muckenthaler, right? He's having, from all I understand, I've been out of touch with him for a while, but he's a youth minister, huge youth ministry. He's involved in ministry, having great success. You know where Parker went to Bible college? Right here. You know what? If people want to go to Bible college and we can help support that, we're all about that. But sometimes there's other factors involved, and sometimes it's just so expensive to go to college anymore and stuff like that. Why in the world am I telling you this? I'll tell you why I'm telling you this. I've been contacted this past year by 2 guys in a church over in Orlando, and they heard about what we've done before too. It's not an easy thing to do. And sometimes we have to get other ministers and other places to help us out. But we've got enough ministers here at this congregation. We are blessed in that way that if we need to do that again, we are more than happy to do that. If somebody in this church, you look at your life and you say, I want to do more, and I'm at a stage in life where I can take some time off and I can be trained for ministry. You know what? As difficult as that is, as a challenge, that we will do that. We will set up classes during the week. We will take the time involved in that. I just want you to know that if you're interested in being training for more ministry, send you somewhere else or do it here. We will band together and make sure that gets done. Does that make sense? You know, one of the things that burdened us and the reason we started to do this at the beginning is because people were going into the ministry with a $50,000 student loan. Ministers don't make real great money in the ministry. And when you have that kind of student, so we decided, if nothing else, we wanted to help some guys. A lot of the people that we helped train here at the church ended up going to Bible college. They just spent a couple of years with us, and we helped them like go to Johnson and different places like that. Other guys, it was a financial thing. We helped them out. I'm spending way too much time talking about this. The only point I want to make is this. Wherever you are as a Christian, one of the things God wants you to do is say to yourself, I need to do more. If you want to do more, We want to help you do more. Does that make sense? I'm ready to move on to the next point. Point number one, here's what you're doing great. You're doing great that you're not just doing good stuff, you're doing more. You're raising the bar, right? Now here's the bad stuff. Here's what you need to stop doing. Very next verse. After he praises him, he says, you're doing more now than you did at first. In verse 20, he says, nevertheless, I have this against you. You tolerate that woman Jezebel. Okay, just in the interest of time, I'm going to tell you, I really don't think her name's Jezebel. I think we're calling her Jezebel because she acts like a Jezebel. Do you know Jezebel? 1 Kings chapter 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. There's a lot going on in the Old Testament, and Jezebel is heavily involved in being a very bad influence. In a nutshell, this is way oversimplification, but here's what Jezebel did. She's married to Ahab, who's king. She brings Baal worship in a strong way. She supports Baal worship being brought into Israel. So in a nutshell, she says it's okay to worship God, but it's also okay to worship these other gods. I think that's what this lady was doing in the church. Let me finish reading the verse. Nevertheless, I have this against you. You tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophet. By her teaching, she misleads the servants into sexual immorality and the eating of food sacrificed to idols. Okay, got to have a little bit of background here. Thyatira was known as a guild city. What is a guild city? It would be parallel to a union city today. It's not exactly like a union city, but there was a lot of parallels. Here's Acts chapter 16. We meet a lady, her name's Lydia. Lydia is a seller of purple, and she's from what town? Thyatira. Thyatira was heavily involved in the textile industry and a lot of wealthy people, business community. And for business to succeed, they had these guilds. What were these guilds? These guilds were like unions, but here's the thing that's important to know. They were unions that were tied to different pagan idols. So if you were involved in a particular company, that meant your company meeting was going to be at Zeus's temple, for example. And you would be involved in participating in that kind of worship. And sometimes the pagan temples, you know why the pagan temples were so popular in the first century and in antiquity? Because many times they had a lot of prostitutes associated with it. And so when it talks about sexual immorality and idolatry, this is not far off, right? And as best we can tell, this woman that he's calling Jezebel is telling everybody, listen, you got to succeed at business. And it's part of your job. So sometimes you got to let your moral standards down a little bit or you're not going to be a success in the business world. And so she's promoting this idea of compromising your faith, right? Got to tell you two quick stories. I'll try to make this as quick as I can. I'm going to change the names. I'm going to call them Steve and Sam. And I hope I remember to call them Steve and Sam all the way through these stories, okay? Steve, both of these happened when I was at other locations, nobody here. I do have stories I could tell people here, but I'm not going to do that. Steve and Sam. Steve, I remember Steve so well because called me up in a panic, and this guy's not the panic kind of guy. This guy was involved in an electronics company. In fact, the people he answered to were not stateside, they were in Japan. I mean, if I told you the name of this, you would recognize it right away. Big, big business. This guy was, I mean, if you saw his house, you would say, wow, what kind of millionaire is this, right? Well, he works for this electronics company. Okay, I work at the church that he's attending at this time. He calls me up in a panic one evening. He wants to meet me right away. Can't wait till tomorrow morning. We go down, we meet at the church building. I've never seen this guy lose his cool. He is in a panic. Why? Because he thinks his marriage is falling apart. Why is his marriage falling apart? Because he's been caught. You know what his wife found? His wife found the credit card that he kept hidden. She had the credit card that she knew about, but he had another credit card. She found the statement with all the strip clubs on it. And he's looking at me, just going to make this story as brief as I can. Oh boy, was this an involved discussion. But he's looking at me and says, Mark, there's no way I could do my job if I didn't take the guys to the strip clubs. It's just expected when they come over. We have our meetings. When we're done with our meetings, I take them to strip clubs. He says, it's always been that way. He had all sorts of excuses, but his bottom line was this: for me to do my job, I got to take these guys to the strip clubs. That's what he said. That's why I want to tell you about Sam. Sam was a guy who lived here in Florida, another place in Florida. The region he lived in, he was, as I understand this, he was number one guy. I mean, he had several locations involved in his business throughout the state. They all answered to him. He's the number one guy. But the headquarters was in Atlanta. And the guys from the headquarters, when they would come down to Central Florida, they expected, after the meetings and everything, they expected to be wined and dined, and their expectation was, after the meetings and eat, take them to the strip clubs. I don't know what it is with business guys. I'm glad I'm a minister. Ministers don't come here and expect to be taken out of the strip clubs. Anyway, he said that was the expectation. But here's the difference about Sam. Sam just became a Christian. Sam just became a Christian. And he told me this after the fact, by the way. I didn't hear this ahead of time. He told me after the fact. He said, you know what? Now that I've committed my life to Christ, I can't lie about this anymore. I can't do this to my wife. I can't do this to my family. And the biggest thing that bothers me is I know God doesn't want me to do this. So here's what he did. The guys came to town. They had their meeting. They went out to a nice place to eat, and they all expected to go to the strip clubs. And as soon as they left the nice restaurant, he said, guys, just trust me. I've got something different planned today. He had rented out one of these go-kart parks, you know, where the spring breakers drive all these little motorized go-karts all over the place and everything. Can you picture these guys in three-piece suits riding these little go-karts around this theme park? He rented out the whole park so they could have the whole thing. And they went way into the evening. And to a man, all these guys from the headquarters in Atlanta came up to him afterwards and said, never had so much fun. I'm so glad you planned it this way. Okay, here's the deal, though. Do you remember the story in the Old Testament, the book of Daniel? There's these three young Hebrew guys who are talking back to the king Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar says, if you don't bow down to my idol, I'm going to throw you in the furnace. Do you remember what they said? They said, you know what? Our God's able to protect us from the furnace. But even if he doesn't, we're not going to bow down to your idol. That was Sam's attitude. Sam told me after the fact, he said, you know what? It was a risk. He said it worked out well and the guys liked it. But he said, I could have lost my job. I was willing to lose my job because I didn't want to do something that God didn't like and would hurt my family and my wife. Listen, the reason I want to tell you a story like that is a lot of guys are like Steve. I called him Steve, right? They think they have to do it. But there are guys like Sam who say, no, you don't have to do it. And you know what? I might lose my job. I might not. God might bless it in a way that works out well. But it doesn't make any difference. I don't have to do that stuff, right? So you don't have to compromise. Okay, now that I spent so much time talking about that, I want to tell you that's not the point of this verse. Here's the point. I want to read the verse to you one more time. Look at this verse with me one more time. He says, nevertheless, this is what I have against you, that you tolerate that woman Jezebel. The reason I think this is so important is a lot of us, at least I hope, a lot of us will never be put in a position where the higher-ups expect us to take them to a strip club. We may never be in a situation where our manager tells us that we have to lie about some report we turn in. We may never be put in a situation where we have to compromise what we think God wants us to do. You and I may not be in this situation, but we know somebody who is. Do you understand what I'm saying? The point he is making is not that you're in that situation yourself. I think he's assuming you know better. The point he's making is, even if you're not in that situation, you tolerate that kind of stuff. Listen, every one of us has some family member or some friend, somebody we know or somebody we live close to, that's doing something that we know. You know what? God does not approve of this. And too many times, when we don't say anything, they take our silence as approval. this is not easy. And I know sometimes it's kind of like you don't want to be a jerk, but you don't have to be a jerk to let people know that's not right. I wish more for you than making that decision or doing what you're doing. 2 weeks ago when I was studying for this sermon, I got an email, and it was from a Christian organization. This last year I got to be on the board, which means I go to these meetings, and they send me stuff all the time. And one of the things they sent me 2 weeks ago while I was studying for this sermon was an advertisement that they're putting out for this Christian group. In this advertisement, I looked at it. They wanted my input. They asked all board members what they thought. I looked at it, and my initial response was, that's fine. It wasn't as good as it could have been, but it was fine. There was nothing wrong with it or anything like that. And my initial thought was, I don't want to be that guy who's hypercritical and everything they do, nitpick and stuff like that. But I'm preparing for this sermon, and I think to myself, this is a Christian ministry. It could be so much better. So I took the time as best I could to write them back and say, hey, if you put this out, there's nothing wrong with it. I'm not going to gripe about it. I'm okay with it. But I just want you to know, I think it can be better, and here's why. I tried to give them the biblical reasoning and ask them to consider doing it just a little different way because of what the Bible says, right? And honestly, it's not hard for me to be opinionated. It's hard for me to say it in a nice way. And so it just took a long time for me to write this email to try to present it in a way where I didn't sound like I was griping, right? And you know what? I thought to myself, okay, well, at least they won't think, that I tolerate something that's subpar, right? Immediately, the guy who's in charge with this got right back with me and thanked me so much. And I thought to myself, you know what? If I would have kept my mouth shut, it would have been okay, but it wouldn't have been as good as it could have been. You understand what I'm saying? So many times it's easy to keep our mouth shut. It's easy not to do anything. It's easy because we don't like people on both sides just to sit back and not even vote. Do you understand what I'm saying? There are a lot of challenges that are not easy to do, but we cannot tolerate evil. And when we're silent, I think the world takes that as approval. We can't afford for that to happen. So there's one more thing. In the interest of time, let me just tell you. It's in verse 28. Here's what you need to do. What do you need to do? You need to set the bar higher. Right? Don't be content. Try to do more. What do you need to avoid? Don't tolerate the bad stuff. Right? Even if you're not involved in it, whatever you can do in as best you possibly can, let people know that you're not supporting the bad stuff, right? But then here's the overarching thought. In verse 28, Jesus presents himself as the bright morning star. He says, I will give to you, if you're faithful and you keep doing this, I will give you the morning star. Well, what is the morning star? Well, if you look later on in the book of Revelation, Jesus specifically says, I am the bright morning star. So that kind of clarifies it, right? It's talking about Jesus is saying, look at it this way. Jesus is saying, you take your stand for me, you may sacrifice a bunch, but you've got me, right? So that's one of the promises. You've got relationship with me. But my question is, why didn't he just say that? Why didn't he just say, life's tough, hang in there, I'm on your side? Why does he call himself the morning star? Well, what is the morning star? Do you know this? In antiquity, try to put yourself 2,000 years ago when this was originally written to the church at Thyatira. In that time, they didn't have the light pollution we have today, right? So when you went out in the middle of the night, the stars were like plugged in. If you've ever seen this, if you've ever gotten away from cities to see the night sky, it's like, whoa, right? Okay, but here's what happens. The closer you get to the sun rising, you're not able to see the stars. In fact, right before the sun comes up over the horizon, there's only one star left that you can see, right? And that's the one, it may be a planet, but anyway, they called it the morning star. Why? Because number one, it's the last star you can see, but number two, You knew when that was the only star that you could see, you knew in just a few minutes the sun was going to be coming up. Now, why would Jesus call himself the morning star? It's not just you've got a relationship with me. He's also communicating this idea, it's almost here. Listen, there's an eternity beyond this life. Look at what's coming, and it will change your perspective on this life. The guy's name's John. John was a little boy during World War II. He and his family lived in Europe. And he says one of his earliest memories is hearing the drone of the bombers from the German Air Force fly overhead as they were getting ready to drop bombs, and the family panicking. And he says he remembers his dad taking his siblings along with him into the hallway, which was in the center of their house. And they kind of huddled there. And he said he remembers his dad praying a prayer. He says he doesn't remember much, but he does remember one line in the prayer. His dad quoted Psalm 91. Psalm 91 is a beautiful psalm. One of the early verses in Psalm 91, it's all about God's protection. It's a great psalm to quote if you're in a time like that. Well, one of the early verses talks about God with his wings covering us and protecting us. And he just remembers his dad praying that prayer, asking God protect them like with wings sheltering them. And you know what? The bombers flew over, their house was never hit. And as a little boy, he thought to himself, I think God answered our prayer. And then he thought, I wonder if everybody who prayed that prayer, if the bombs missed them. I wonder if everybody who didn't pray that prayer got bombed. And he got thinking to himself, I don't think that's how that works. And he really got to thinking about Psalm 91. And I want you to think about Psalm 91. It does say God will protect you with his wings. It also says God will send his angels to protect you. In fact, there's a guy named Satan who quoted Psalm 91 when he was tempting Jesus. Do you remember this? He took Jesus to the high point in the temple and he said, jump off. And then he quotes Psalm 91. Remember the part where he says his angels will protect you and not allow you to strike your foot against a stone? Well, he quotes Psalm 91. You know, right there in the Bible it says God's going to protect you. Go ahead and jump. And do you remember how Jesus responded? Jesus said, the Bible also says, don't put God to the test. Which I interpret to mean, don't ask God for safety travel if you're going to go 85 miles above the speed limit. Don't ask God to give you good health if you're going to abuse drugs and smoke 12 packs of cigarettes every day. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's kind of like don't put God to the test, right? But would you think about this with me just a little bit more? I think it's more than that. What is this psalm really talking about when it talks about he won't allow your foot to strike against the stone? He'll protect you with his wings. Does that mean that every time you're in a difficult situation, you're not putting God to the test, he's going to protect you? Did Jesus say to Mary and Martha, if you believe in me, you're never going to die? Or did he say, if you believe in me, you're going to live even though you die? Yeah. Did Psalm 23 say you're never going to face the valley of the shadow of death? Or did it say, even though you face the valley of the shadow of death, I am there with you. My rod and my staff, they comfort me as I go through that. You see that psalm, I don't think that psalm's talking about you pray this psalm and then all the bad stuff goes away. No, there's a bigger picture here. You're going to have to face the difficult times, but you know what? We've got the morning star. What does that mean? That means we've got a hope that goes beyond this life, and it doesn't just go beyond this life. It changes our attitude towards everything we face in this life. Does that make sense? Listen, I know this sounds a little bit goofy, but one of the stories that's always stuck with me, it's kind of a legend that comes out of the Crusades. They say one of the Muslim invaders came, and he was a sheik, and he put a sword to one of the Christians' leaders. And he was in front of a whole bunch of people. He was just trying to show off. He whips out his sword. He puts it up to the neck of the Christian leader, and he says, "Aren't you afraid? Don't you know who I am? I'm the man who can run you through with my sword without batting an eye." And the Christian leader looked right back at him and said, "Yeah, and I'm the Christian who can be run through with a sword without batting an eye." Do you understand what he was saying? You can kill me. I got a hope that goes beyond this life, and it changes my attitude towards everything I face in this life. Do you understand what Jesus is saying? Here it is. You want to be the kind of person you want to be, that God wants you to be? Do more of what you know is good. Don't tolerate and go silent on the stuff that you know is not good. And remember, there's a bigger picture that affects everything that we face through this life. And we're going to celebrate that now. We come to the table and thank God. He makes a difference on everything we face, right? Right? When you pray, when you're ready, would you come to one of the tables?